Smaller classroom, so you guys get to ask all the questions that you guys want. We can really kind of dive as deep as you guys want. But covering blind versus blind, which I know I understudy, which I think is generally probably understudied. So yeah, I think it's a fun one. It was fun to put this one together for me just to kind of like refresh as well my knowledge through some blind versus blind spots and especially navigating. We won't go super deep into post flop, but really just look at a couple flops and see how it differs, especially compared to, let's say, a typical single raise pot and what we would expect as a pre-flop aggressor in flop dynamics and how that might differ in blind versus blind when ranges are just a lot wider. So a quick preview on kind of like what we'll cover, but why blind versus blind matters. We're going to look into small blind opening ranges, big blind defending ranges, and then we'll look at a couple flops, and then I'll ask you guys as well to do a little bit of thinking in groups in terms of how you think certain strategies will play out on flops. But sorry, it's just me today, so I'm going to be letting people in as we go. But a couple main starters on why blind versus blind matters. So welcome. So generally it's going to be reasonably high frequency. I mean, every orbit you will find yourself potentially in one of these spots. I mean, obviously when somebody raises, it's you're no longer necessarily in that blind versus blind spot, but it does happen at a decent high frequency. It's the only pre-flop spot when you're in the small blind where you end up raising and you're actually out of position. So that is a very unique to blind versus blind. I mentioned it is generally understudied. And I think as a result of it being understudied is there's a lot of room for exploitative play because when people are playing these super wide ranges, there's a lot of guessing and their tendencies really start to show. So, on certain boards where you have to defend like really wide because the ranges are so wide, some players who are, let's say, more nitty or more tight, that's going to really show in these blind versus blind spots where if you just, bet range in some scenarios, you can really exploit some players who are just going to be dramatically overfolding and or not check raising you nearly as much as they should with a bunch of like really uncomfortable stuff, like some like really dusty backdoor stuff, which they're supposed to, but just people are not finding. And you're going to see because ranges are so wide, they should be finding a lot of these that a lot of players do not. So yeah, lots of room for exploitative play. Something I didn't know here is also like the meta as well. When you're going to usually be in a blind battle versus the same players on your left or right if you're playing like a 12-hour day of poker. So it starts to get really kind of a little more like psychologically in the weeds as well. It's like, okay, this guy raised my big blind the last 3 times, so I think he had it or he didn't have it, and it can kind of like fuck someone up where somebody like really punts into you if they're just like they think you're really trying to like get after them, which worked out for me one time deep in like a 5K in the WPT Venetian where like I actually just had it every single time where this guy limped to me in the big blind. I had like aces once and then ace king once, and like every single time, like 3 or 4 orbits, I just raised him. We end up getting in like a medium-sized pot each one. It ended up being a massive pot the last one, and he's just like, fuck, I don't know, you're just like attacking me every single time. And then he just ends up like calling like super light when I just had like the nuts. So it's like, I don't know, people will get like frustrated and they'll just be like, this guy's like going after me every time. And so it builds some of that, you get some of those patterns when you're basically kind of battling the same person every round. So we'll start here with the first node in blind versus blind and start with pre-flop opening ranges. A few questions for you guys, generally thinking, and we'll see how this kind of changes across varying stack depths. But the first question is, what percent of our range, roughly, do you think we should generally be VPIPing in the small blind? And let's just take at like 60 big blinds stack depth. So what percent of our range, and that means both calling or raising, and you can either answer by like you think a lot or like like 50% of hands, like 30% of hands, 80% of hands.
I think like
85% of hands, so like a lot.
I know it. I mean, I don't know, but I'm thinking it has to be 80. I don't know if it would be 90, so I'd say 85.
Yeah, pretty high. Yeah. So I mean, clearly you guys, yeah. So it's pretty high. We are going to be VPIPing a lot, definitely around that 90% range. When you guys think about how you want to split your range between limping and raising, what are the kind of like hand classes that you guys start to segment or bucket things into when you're playing out in the small blind? Maybe we could start with the like limping.
So you would want to limp both the top of your range as well as some offsuit junk hands so that you can balance yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so aces, kings you limp as well as 7-4 offsuit. I mean that's just too low in the range, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
jack 7 offsuit, etc. So that you can kind of balance your range that you're limping with.
Yeah, yeah, you're gonna see a limps from a lot of hands across your entire range. But yes, you're definitely gonna have a mix of limps with the top of your range. You can have a mix with some obviously some dusty hands. When we think about raising, what kind of hands do we want to raise with? Raise with for value, and then also raising as a bluff. Where do you think that starts to come from?
Maybe I wonder if it's like player dependent. Like, so I'm thinking recently about like the difference between raising a linear range versus a polarized range. So if the player's gonna like call a lot, then maybe I want a linear range. But if they're kind of like three bet or fold, then maybe polarized.
Okay.
So like ace four.
So you'll more play like a bit more exploitatively when you're battling the blinds and really heavily dependent on who's in the big blind. Whether you think that they're going to just like flat super wide, but not really necessarily raise you a bunch. Um, okay. What do you guys think from like a GTO perspective, where we probably expect the big blind to defend reasonably wide? Um, yeah. What do you guys think?
We definitely want to raise hands that dominate our opponent's calling range,
Mhm.
and then for bluffs, I guess just hands that block their best or don't remove their like folding range. So maybe I wouldn't raise if I have like a deuce or a three in my hand because I'm hoping they have a deuce or a three if I'm raising as a bluff.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool. So yeah, so you'll have hands like maybe ace x, like king x. So you're gonna see like a lot of raises, a little more linearly with like suited ace x, like strong suited broadways. Like the top of range, you're definitely gonna have more mix and traps, but you're gonna see some of that like upper echelon stuff mostly going for a raise. We'll look at a second where kind of like our raise bluffs come from. But now, how do you guys think this shifts? Let's talk about VPIP frequency from as the stack depths change. Let's say from 100 down to 10 bigs. So do you think VPIP is going to change much across these stack depths? And then how about raising frequency as well?
I think you play a little bit tighter, and probably you're jamming a lot of hands.
At lower stack depths?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a little tighter, but VPIP's still we're gonna be playing a lot of hands potentially, but a little tighter. How about raising frequency?
Well, I don't think you're ever gonna put in like a 30 or stack and fold, so I guess you might have I don't know. I guess you might have some min opens, but probably you're just raising less, I would think, because you're either jamming or
Become tighter, yeah.
As you get shallower, you think you're raising less. So
you
like
have 10 bigs. Like it's kind of a disaster to put in even two and a half.
right, like two and a half bigs.
So,
Yeah.
so I think you'd be raising less and just jamming like this.
Mhm. What about between 100 and 40 bigs? You guys think there's like a meaningful difference in raising frequency?
Should be a bit tighter for sure.
Okay, so raising less as we get
Yeah.
shallower.
Yeah,
Cool.
maybe exploitative, but yeah, I mean,
Do you guys agree with that?
I mean, I probably wouldn't play it very different. Probably should, but I probably don't.
That's how I play.
Cool.
To be honest,
Yeah, like raise. So like when you're deeper, you like raise more. You get more flexibility, and then as you get shallower, being potentially doing a bit more limping. Cool. Let's take a look.
I think the number one thing I would ask myself is like, am I a better player? Am I going to outplay the big blind post flop?
yeah.
Mm,
That
yes.
depends. The playability depends.
Because I'd be folding
Yes.
a lot. If the big blind is solid, I'd be folding like more than if I think I can outplay them.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. Well, let's take a look at an equilibrium, and then we can talk about some spots, and we can talk about potentially some spots for exploits. But what I will say, actually, I'll let the charts speak for themselves. So This is a small blind opening strategy off 100 bigs. So basically, we talked about VPO. I said around 90%. So you can see raised 9%, limp 81%. That's almost exactly 90% of hands we're playing. We're gonna kind of see a similar VPIP frequency across all stack depths. It starts to get a little narrower, of course, as we get thinner in bigs, but um, there is going to be a noticeable pattern in terms of the hands that we're raising and the raising frequency. So our raising frequency is pretty narrow. So I think, and sorry, I'm forgetting your name. It was Abhishek. Yes, thank you, Abhishek. So you're saying yes, you're limping that top of range. So we're trapping with the top of range. I mentioned how a lot of our suited broadways, suited ace-x, so this is more linear part of a range that we're just almost pure raising with. And then we've got like an assortment of bluffs with like some blocker property stuff like ace x off, king x off, queen x off kind of stuff. And then we've got some like suited stuff that just has like decent implied odds if we end up hitting like two pairs or like make flushes, things like that. I guess you said like you would probably avoid some of the 2x, but like what I found, especially from the small blind opening range, it really kind of favors these sort of like 10 deuce suited, 9-3 suited, 9 deuce suited kind of hands. Probably a question I should ask my coach because I don't know exactly why it comes from that region, but I just see that pretty commonly. So I will tend to almost pure raise these kind of holdings when I'm in the small blind, depending on the stack depth I'm at. But we'll kind of see how that shifts. And then of course you've got your mix of like suited connectors and stuff like that as well.
Probably because those hands benefit from just getting the fold right away, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah, but I guess like why those and not like I don't know, like 8-3 suit, like specifically the 10 and 9, and I mean in this case you see some of the Jack X suited. Whereas like I would almost assume like something like 8 deuce suited or 8-3 suited is more efficient as a bluff. It's more dusty. You get more of the 9x, 10x, Jack X to fold. So yeah, I don't know. It's a weird one. Maybe the blocker because you've got that one higher card. But I think the more interesting pattern here is how raising frequency changes and it actually goes up the shallower you get. So the one thing that I actually almost do pure, especially at big stack depths, is you'll actually see like at 200 bigs, you almost have like no raises. And so like at 100 bigs, actually a lot of my strategy personally, and like I know like my coach does this a lot. I've talked to Chris Brewer a bit about it, is like you're almost playing a pure limping strategy. Like obviously this is not a pure limping strategy, but you can play like close to like a pure limping strategy out of the small blind at deep stack depths. It's just like there's not a lot to fight for. Like as a percentage of your stack, there's not that much dead money in the middle. It doesn't benefit your stack that much to go up 2% by taking down the ante and the big blind. And then because ranges are so wide, like post flop situations out of position are just so tough to navigate. So you find yourself in really tricky spots where you have to call down like super light with like fourth pair sometimes and just find yourself in these uncomfortable spots, potentially getting into a big pot, which is why you'll find a lot more passivity at deep stack depths where the stack off thresholds are going to be like a lot higher. So you'll see just compared to 60 big blinds already, we've got like a 50% increase in our raising frequency. So we're still VPIPing around 90%, but now we're raising 14% instead of 9%. And where our raises are coming from is just a little bit more of everything we saw. So we're not really pulling from different regions. It's still like that suited ace-x, suited broadways. Our aces and kings are trapping a little less. We're still that same offsuit region, the same like suited region, but now we've got like some of the 7-3 suited stuff. It's just increasing the frequency. And then when we compare this now to 40 big blinds, that almost doubles from what we were seeing at 60 big blinds. So now we've got a raising frequency of 25%. So clearly we see this pattern that raising goes up. And again, because at this point, it's just stealing those two big blinds becomes a lot more consequential. Now it's not 2% of our stack, but close to like 5% of our stack. So taking down the pot right now and not playing a pot out of position becomes a little more meaningful. And as I mentioned, like this is a spot where I mentioned like the 10 deuce suited, a 9 deuce suited, 9-3 suited, 10-3 suited. Like if I see these hands in like the small blind off around this like 40 big blind stack, I'm pretty much raising these pure. These are like my like most typical bluffs that I'm pulling from. And then you're mixing in some of the suited connectors, obviously your strong value hands. a whole bunch of mix of like your offsuit stuff. Yeah, I'll pause there because I know that was like hopefully that's like a real at least one big takeaway is like you're actually supposed to be raising more as you're getting shallower from the small blind as opposed to less. And that could be one thing already that you guys can kind of take away and implement in your pre-flop strategy out of the blinds. But any questions about this? Anything that looks weird just looking at the first couple charts? Yeah.
Does this remain true at the extreme end of limp shallow? So does it remain 30, 20, 10? Does it
We're gonna look at that.
to raise the raise frequency continues to go up?
It's a good question. And what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, like, based on the logic, I would say yes. But what I'm having trouble with is like when you're so on the extreme, you're
Mm-hmm.
now kind of like playing raise or your tournament length.
Mm-hmm.
And that may matter depending on where
Right.
the tournament you go.
Yeah, so yes, we're gonna see as well is like raising frequency is gonna go up as you get even shallower. It's just gonna start to get split between min raises or not min raises, but like raising for like 3x versus going all in. You're gonna see that more, especially at the 20 big blinds and below. But we'll take a look.
Observation. So more of the offsuit hands are raising rather than the suited hands. That's because of the post-flop playability, is it?
It just needs to pull like I mean you can see we're raising a decent amount of hands for value here, right? Like a lot of these suited ace-x, suited broadways. So it just needs to pull enough bluffs. I wouldn't say necessarily as like a in terms of number of combos it's raising more, because there's a lot more combos of these off-suited hands. So you don't need to pick as many suited ones. Sorry, am I saying this properly? Yeah, sorry. You don't need to pick, or you need to pick more of these because there's a lot more combinations of them. That's why you're seeing like a sliver of a lot more of them picked, but that's at least my guess on that one. So now we can look at 20 big blinds. So same pattern. Now the overall raising frequency has gone up from 24% to 30%, but now we're mixing in jams. And where our jams are coming from, very typical, is offsuit ace-x and lowest pairs. You start to see a bit of like these like middling suited hands start to mix in as well. But generally speaking, at this 20 big blind level, you're just going to see a lot of this like low middling offsuit ace-x and low pairs just start to jam it in. You're still seeing raises as bluffs from the same sort of regions. You're seeing less of that like raising from the like that what do you call it, like our linear value part of our range. Some of those are now also just like limp trapping here. So especially like your suited ace-x is just kind of like limping, and then if you get ISO, then they're like limp jamming. Similar with some of those like middling pairs and some of those suited broadways. But yeah, so again, higher increased raise frequency.
What's like the threshold for that kind of limp if you get ISO jamming? Ace 5 kind of hand? Like what's the suited Broadway threshold?
What's the so we'll look at it in a second. I'll show you the chart, but you're gonna see it's kind of like it'll match in a similar pattern, which were like the hands that were somewhat good enough to raise for value before, they start to become like decent candidates for like limp trapping. So like a lot of these like ace-x are gonna be your classic kind of like limp traps. For example, like those pairs, those like suited broadways. But yeah, we'll look at that one in a second. This is now at 15 bigs. So we went up now from 30% to 34%, but now just having a lot more jams. We just benefit a lot more from taking down the pot. Taking 2 big blinds is 12% of our stack, something like that. So just immediately picking up those 2 big blinds is quite significant for us. And then we're expanding to pretty much all offsuit ace-x, now some middling king x offsuit, and then going up this sort of like suited branch. We're having a lot less raises, so it's more like inducing very polarized, like basically aces, kings, queens, and then a bunch of like bluffs.
What stage of the tournament would this be?
This is all chip EV.
Oh,
Yeah. All of this is chip EV.
but with an ante.
With an ante, correct.
Okay.
All of this is chip EV with an ante. ICM it really depends. Obviously, the stacks across like the other stacks across the table, but when there's a lot more what do we call risk premium on like the big blind, then we just get to be even more aggressive. I mean, at the 10 big blind level, when there's like a stack there and a bunch of like even smaller stacks, then there's some cases where we're just like jamming like 70-80% of hands. Yeah,
But that also
but it's all
depends
chippy
on
V.
their understanding of the ICM pressure, right? Even for
Yes,
me,
that's true. Yes, it relies on them understanding. So ICM is always this sensitive thing because it's like, how much is your opponent respecting ICM? How much do we want to respect ICM? And what adjustments do we want to make? But I think it's always good to start with understanding what the baseline chippy V strategy is, how ICM is supposed to dictate or move our strategy, and then how do we think our opponents are actually playing so we can adjust in real time. So lastly, we see 10 big blinds. Yeah, we're like jamming 50% of hands. So jamming a ton of hands. We still are going to be limping, basically no raises at this point. We've got some limp traps with top of range, and then we've got like some limps with like just cuspy bottom of range that don't feel good enough to jam. But you know, if they check back, then we can get to see kind of like a free flop. But yeah, so now we're pretty much raising 50% of hands. So again, the main thing here is that as stacks get shallower, our raising frequency goes up. It went from 9 or 8% at 100 bigs to 50% at 10 bigs. And then you start to have jams at this like 20 big blind stack depth. Those are kind of the main takeaways from small blind opening range. Any questions? Or we're all good here. So kind of what I just covered, like raise frequency climbs, raise composition shifts. So actually, I don't think I really covered this one much, but let me see, where can we see this most represented? So I think basically what you're going to start seeing a bit more, I think this is, Abhishek, what you're kind of alluding to, which is we do start to add more into the offsuit region as we're getting shallower. And it just generally is going to be the ones that kind of benefit a bit more from getting immediate folds, whereas the suited hands will just have a bit more playability, which is why there's a bit of a shift away. Like, for example, here, we're not really raising. I mean, this, we don't have as many raises at all, but there's a lot less of the raises from the suited region compared to before versus the offsuit region. So I think that's what that one's alluding to is a bit of a shift in the composition. But generally speaking, like our VPIP overall is still quite large, and we're going to be continuing a lot of hands and not wanting to fold too much. Okay. So next is small blind limping ISO dynamics. So what I mean by ISO dynamics, so like so the small blind is limped. Now we're in the big blind. And what are the dynamics of, so we get to play 100% of our range because we can obviously just check and go to a flop. But now what are the kind of hands that we're choosing to raise with? What are the hands that we're choosing to check with? So I guess the first question, what percent of our range generally do you guys think that we are going to choose to raise with? And again, we can maybe take 60 big blinds as kind of the effective stack size.
At what depth?
60 big blinds.
Oh, sorry, you said that.
Yeah. 30%? Cool.
I'm gonna go higher. I like
Okay.
like 65.
65%? Okay, so quite aggressive. Yep.
I mean, we're gonna have the best hand. Well, they're folding like 15% of the time, so we're gonna have the best hand like 40-some% of the time. When they limp in, maybe more.
Yeah, they're limping a lot of their range at 60 big blinds. Yeah, like I think they're raising, what was it, 14%. So they're limping a ton because we're relatively deep.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're definitely going to be doing quite a bit of raising.
So they folded their worst hands. They're
Mhm.
raising some of their better hands.
Mhm.
So they're limping. So I mean, we should have the best hand more than 50% of the time. So I think we could raise more than 50%.
Cool. So you say 65%, I heard 30%. So maybe something in that range. What kind of hand class do you guys start to pick now? Do you guys pick suited hands? Do you pick off-suited hands? do you pick? Like obviously there's your clear value stuff that you might want to raise, but maybe like where do you want to start pulling your bluffs from?
Same as small blind, the offsuit hands should be more.
Okay, so in the small blind, I think what you guys notice is there's a lot of these like middling offsuit hands that we were choosing, like Jack 7 off, like Queen 8 off. It wasn't like your like, so it was a kind of like in this middling range, and then you had some of these like one high, one low suited ones. Do you guys think we're seeing a similar pattern here out of the big blind to ISO, choosing the same hands
As bluffs or
as bluffs? Yeah.
Mix of them with some, the linear part of our range as well up top.
Okay, so you're saying similar bluff region, and then also of course our value region. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts, guesses before we take a look?
we have a lot of incentive to just check our worst hands, so I don't know which one of those we'd be bluffing with.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Okay, so you think, yeah, so you probably agree with Abhishek then, like our worst hands, we still, okay, cool. And then last couple is, how do you guys think overall raising frequency? So we saw how raising frequency really changed with stack depths from the small blind. Well, how do you guys think it changes when you're in the big blind, when limp to, and if so, in sort of what direction?
I wouldn't think so. The logic is like, well, it's a greater percentage of your stack, so if you can take it down enough, increase your stack by a greater percentage, why not?
Okay, so you think it matches a pattern where we're still going to be raising, we're going to be raising more as stack depth gets shallower because of the dead money in the middle. Cool. Okay, let's take a look. So in these cases, I'm going to have on the left side is the big blind ISO strategy versus small blind limp. And on the right is the small blind response to big blind ISO. So we'll just pay attention to the left first, which is, so in this case, it was kind of in between. This is at 100 bigs, so we'll look at it at 60 bigs, but it's about 40% of hands. So here we're not doing any trapping with our top of range because like there's no trap, there's nobody who can like bet behind us. We're closing out the action. So all of our top of range, we're just betting. We're betting our top of range, and then we're also betting our more linear part of like our value hands. There is a bit of that similar like suited stuff, like the 9 deuce suited, really preferring like having a deuce. And what you'll find like a pretty stark contrast with the big blind ISO and raising bluff range from the small blind is where the small blind would have these middling offsuit. There's like this, they call it this like pyramid of trash for like the big blind ISO range, which is like literally like this pyramid down here, which is literally like your worst offsuit hands is actually where most of your bluffs are being pulled from. So we become really dominant in these worst offsuit hands. So yeah, like 10-3 off, like 9-4 off, all these kind of hands are starting to mix at a pretty reasonable frequency. And then I highlight the small blind response range because the one thing that we always want to pay attention to in like defending ranges when they're calling is kind of like what's their worst offsuit, like what's their offsuit cutoff threshold that they're going to be calling with. And in this case, it's like they're basically pretty much calling every offsuit 8x. And then that's going to determine, it's like, okay, what kind of boards are they going to hit very frequently because they have all the offsuit combos versus not all the offsuit combos. And that's going to start to dictate how and when we get to be aggressive on certain flops based on what is prevalent in their range. But yeah, so you'll see like we have a lot of this like really dusty offsuit stuff in that pyramid of trash, and they're folding all of that. So this is a bit of foreshadowing when it comes to like flop play and where we start to think about, what flops do we get to be aggressive on and really see betting based on these ranges. Any questions on this? Anything surprising? Oh, I think someone.
Sorry, can you just highlight the small blind 3-bet threshold?
Yeah, so the small blind 3-bet threshold is basically all the top of range stuff that we were trapping with. So like our best pairs. I mean, there's like the top of range stuff, like our best ace-x off, suited ace-x, a mixing of some of our suited Broadway stuff. And then we're mixing like some of our like bluffs, which are mostly coming from like our suited connectors that are going to be, especially have like, good chance of making potentially a good hand, flushes, straights, etc. And then some blocker oriented stuff like ace X off, ace four suited, king five suited, king four suited. So nothing really too surprising. We basically got our limp traps with our top of range, and then we've got some like pretty standard like bluffs with like blocker properties or like suited connectors. So now we see this at 60 big blinds and see how this changes. So it is going up slightly. It's not as pronounced as it was because we're already raising with 40 something percent of range. It's not starting at 9%. We're already using at 40% and it goes up a little bit as we're getting shallower to 43%. But you're pretty much saying the same thing. That period of trash is just getting, more pronounced. But you're gonna notice pretty reasonably that like what's really shifting, this is where our raises come from actually starts to shift because you see a decent amount from that suited region. It's going to become less and less. We're almost like not really raising any of those dusty suited hands anymore. We're still raising some suited connectors, but that's really shifting more to this period of trash offsuit region. So this is at 60 big blinds. At 40 big blinds, you kind of see that start to become more pronounced. And we're like pure raising with what is that, 7 deuce off in the bottom, right? Like so, like taking obviously like complete bottom of range, because again we just benefit. We just get so many folds here, or we just benefit from getting folds so often, from so much of like that middling part of their range, and just using like our stone bottom of range to kind of ISO here.
Does the race size change with the change in the size?
Yeah. So you're gonna see the sizes start to change. So it was like 4x at 100 bigs, 3.5 at 60 bigs, 3.25. So it's getting smaller, obviously, as the shallower that we get. You just don't need to raise as big as you get shallower. And then, you're gonna see like the the small blind response strategy, I think, is still pretty similar. You're just seeing less raising now with these suited connectors, which is kind of similar with three betting strategies, just generally pre-flop, where when you're deeper, you're seeing a lot more three bet bluffs with your suited connectors. And then when you're deep and you've got like great implied odds to make big hands, flushes, straights, obviously as you get shallower, you get less of that. Your equity realization gets lower, so you're not really doing that with your suited connectors anymore. But you're still trapping with your other top of range hands, and now you're gonna have some like limp jams. You're gonna see more limp jams as you get shallower and shallower. So this is at 40 bigs. This is at 20 bigs, I believe. Yep, 20 bigs. And from 60 down to like everything is still kind of in this like 40% region of us raising in the big blind. Now we're just mixing more all in. So it's between 40 to 45%. So there's actually not really a significant increase as we're getting shallower.
Okay. I think we should like really specifically define like what the solver is solving for here. Like for example, if the small blind limps to me, I have 20 bigs, and I have ace five suited, or sorry, ace five off. Like in game, why not raise to like 3x, 4x?
Versus
That's a jam. It has it as a jam, right?
ace five off specifically, it has it as raise or
Okay, so
or
ace
check.
six. I can't
So yeah,
see
take
that.
a6 off. A6 off. It has it as a jam. Why not? You're asking like why not just raise? So these are the solver chooses these hands, and it's similar when you see this like 20 big blind or less. Like it's gonna be pretty happy to stack off with these like offsuit ace-x, low suited connectors because one, they do good at like blocking your opponent's calling range.
I'm asking less like why that hand. And
Okay.
like we know why the solver gives a solution. It gives a solution so it can't be exploited. If I 3x or 4x that hand, like what's the exploit?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't necessarily have maybe the answer you're looking for.
The solver is probably working to prevent is me going 3x with that hand, 3.5x, and then getting jammed on and having to fold it. But I don't really know a lot of players who like find the exploit in that spot.
I don't know necessarily if the exploit would be getting jammed on, because I think it would be if we forced it to just have like no jams with offsuit ace x and only raises, I'm fairly certain it would just call off all of the ace x and feel reasonably okay to do so. Perhaps it's more so when you just get the call and you're playing post flop versus just like taking a pot down and then also being okay if you do get called because still doing decent equity wise against their calling range when you do jam, perhaps. But
I mean, if like this is kind of my point though.
Mhm.
You just said you don't know what the exploit would be. So
I don't. Yeah.
who am I ever playing against that knows how to exploit that?
Hmm.
So I would just 3x it and like give myself some more options, give myself some more. Like if I think my opponents are overfolding to jam, I'd way rather jam like a king high than
Right.
ace high. So
Yes. Yeah, I think that's
I just
a
think
reasonable
like
exploit.
looking at these solutions and being like, oh, I should jam, you know, 10% of my range here at 20 big blinds. I think if we don't even know what exploit we're trying to prevent by doing that, like it's not something that I would advocate, in my opinion.
That's fair. I think that's yeah, I think that's very fair. I think there is a lot of exploits that can be derived. I think if you're choosing worse hands and ones that like if we think our opponents are over calling with let's say hands and we could just play a pot in position against somebody in a blind versus blind scenario where ranges are wide and we're just going to get to steal a bunch of the time on flops, then maybe just not like you maybe just don't even want to have any jams at all. Yeah, I think that's very valid. Yeah, so of course it's going to be extremely player dependent, and kind of as we talked about in the beginning, like blind versus blind dynamics can really derive like you can derive a lot of exploits based on what you think your opponent's tendencies are, because I think those will really kind of shine in these spots where you kind of have nowhere to hide because you're going to wind up in a spot with like 9-5 off and you're like what the hell am I supposed to do on like a certain kind of board. So yeah, I think it's a valid point, Peter. So what? Let me ask. What would you? So how would you play these spots then? Are you saying then like you personally prefer to jam less in these spots and just play more post flop in blind versus blind off 20 bigs?
You know, the solver is trying to provide us with an unexploitable strategy. I would just always think like, well, what exploit am I worried about that I have to choose, that I have to opt for an unexploitable strategy? Because if my opponent isn't going to find an exploit against me, I'm going to try to find an exploit against them.
Hmm.
Yeah, like if I was playing the tournament tonight, I probably wouldn't want to stack off with ace six off. Like it might be good enough in theory, but I think in practice, like I don't have to. I can probably win just as much and lose a little bit less by not stacking off with it. I get threes and fours. That's probably a good jam because
Mm-hmm.
anything that folds, that's good for you. And if they call, you're probably still winning. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we need to like mix bluffs. Like if fives and sixes and fours were jamming for value, I don't think I need to mix in bluffs. Like I'm not worried that my opponents are going to exploit me if I don't find bluffs in that spot.
Fair. Yeah, I think I can only really speak to why the solver does kind of what it does here, which is like obviously twos through sixes. I think intuitively we know if we just raise, like our opponents are going to have a lot of like two over cards where we've it's pretty much a flip, and if we can just take down our two bigs right now and just win 10% of the pot, that's a pretty big win for us. I think even a hand like these like low ace deuce off versus like jack 10 off, which probably you're supposed to see some calls with this like with queen 10 off and like jack 10 off, but I think in reality people are under calling versus jam, which is why personally an exploit that I will use in these scenarios where I'm 20 big blinds or less and like button raises and I'm in the small blind with like ace 4 off, like I feel like it overperforms in recreational fields, and I would expect that to be a similar case when you start to jam here with ace deuce off and you get, I don't know, you get somebody to fold like king jack off for 20 bigs against my jam with ace deuce off. I think that's pretty good result personally, because I think people are less likely to put the money in and call off in these thresholds.
Yeah, I already said this, but I'd probably rather jam with king four off than if I'm.
Yeah, I mean, you jam king four off, you get king jack off to fold. That's a huge win. Yeah. Cool. We'll look at a couple more to close this one out, but I think this is just nothing too surprising. What is this? This is 15 big blinds, ISOing. So looks pretty similar. Again, I think just that pyramid of trash is like a little more like cut out, and you've got the boundaries around it. So just know that like you see these hands, you get limped to, you want to find raises with these hands. Um, and then this is the last one at like, what is this, 10 big blinds. So we're still having some raises even at 10 big blinds as the big blind. Yeah.
King X is jamming a lot more than the ace
You're right.
is.
Yeah, so now kind of what you're talking about, you're starting to jam. And I think as a factor, kind of like that threshold is getting lower and lower as we're getting lower in stack depth, which is why we're starting like our ace X just becomes good enough for value that we want to do some more inducing as opposed to just jamming. But now our bottom King X is now at that threshold, which is it's like a mergey jam that we're choosing to do. Yeah, so the main thing here to take away is big blinds ISO is a lot more polar, right? So we saw we're always raising top of range stuff, and then we've got this pyramid of trash that we're raising with. So a lot of big blind bluffs coming from that trash region. Small blind is supposed to call pretty wide, and their three bets are pretty polar.